went to Glasgow. I stayed in Bells Hill. That's me on the right with my sister, who's a bigger girl, and my cousin and my gran. I grew up outside this city in the largest area council housing in Western Europe at the time, Lanarkshire. Happy, healthy, and my parents still live in that house. But my Glasgow wasn't a big shiny city. It had a history and a past that resonated through my family. A socialist tradition, a struggle, progress, and that included lots of marches and meetings and banners. That's my grandfather. There is his second from your right. He was a cyclist and with his Clarion comrades here. He was a communist and he worked in the steelworks. He was born in 1901, he died in '66, and he represented a generation of working people that took their class from poverty in that time. And his Glasgow and my Glasgow represented by the labour movement tradition, Red Clydeside, tanks in George Square, unprecedented numbers of strikes of women workers in the two wars. That's my dad, and he was part of the labour movement too, but he had a much easier ride because of the work that had been done by the movement for him. Decent working conditions, nice council housing, none of these were gifts, and his generation worked really hard to maintain that struggle for social progress. You know, here's representing some of those images in steelworks and shipyards and foundries. And they still really resonate today. I mean, we saw that when Jim Reid died. They had a collective experience. They look strong and confident and powerful and dignified. They also look like the kind of people you want to go for a pint with, and that's important. And it was about a system where people got educated and self-education was expected. Working class communities had political influence and strength, and they could get organised to around health centres and housing conditions. It wasn't just their wage packets that were improved, and that's important. We've got to seek achievement not just for ourselves, but for our communities, and our ambitions need to be broad enough to include their aspirations. La Passionara, I think, symbolises that on the Clyde. Here it is in its inauguration in '79, a monument to the men who went to fight in Spain. And my story starts here. Alec Dominic came into the city and started protesting about nuclear weapons and the fight for peace, and I filled the streets and lines that my grandparents and my father and my mother had filled. I had no idea, of course, what was round the corner, and that was, of course, Thatcherism, which there we were, not quite as smartly dressed as them, but certainly with the same art of protest. But what happened in our generation was incredibly significant for this city, because the structures that had been built up, the safeguards that had been built up, were systematically attacked and destroyed. And the futures that they had built for their children didn't exist for us. There wasn't jobs, and our city began to disintegrate. And it caused, I think, real structural damage. And when we look and think about all the influences that changed our city and shaped it, you know, there's fundamental things we need to think about, and that's the gap between rich and poor. If you look at that, it's so tiny you can't see it. You see this big sharp drift in the difference between rich and poor, and you know, right at the 80s, what happens? We start to climb up again. And my proposition to you is that, you know, there's a correlation between that and what's happened to working class people. I didn't just protest, I did a fair amount of partying, and I used to go to paddies for my clothes, like I'm sure a lot of people in here did. And it's such a symbol of Glasgow to me. It felt like a real symbol of strength and dignity, and it was funny and smart, and it seemed to symbolise, you know, what working class Glasgow was. But then it was demonised. It was demonised by our city's fathers, who called it a crime-ridden midden. And for me, it certainly wasn't that. But then working class people have been demonised. They've been called Neds and Chavs. You know, no longer are the symbols of dignity and struggle. And I think that that's very sad. The traders felt that the accusations that had been made against them about their stalls were not true, and that it was a homeless hostel next to it that had been the source of much of the crime, but they paid the price, and we lost an important part of our city. These are my sisters and brothers in Unison NHS Glasgow and Clyde branch, because you see that's what trade unions look like now. They look like you and me, just ordinary people. You walk past them in the shops doing their messages, looking after their reins. But they're still working really hard and struggling to maintain the standards that the people came before us. And we feel very connected to those people, even though we look a bit different. There's more women, there's less hats, sadly less hats, but we're still the largest civic organisation in the country, and I don't think that we think enough about what that means in our community or the strengths it could bring to building our community. I chair Glasgow Trades Council and I organise quite a lot of demonstrations, and whenever we do, the city officers and the police tell us we don't want you in the city because you're disrupting the flow of the commercial business of the city. We don't want to see you marching through the city, and they try and not allow us to do that. But I think it's such an important symbol in our city to see ordinary people, you know, standing up strong and proud and standing up for the things that matter, which is a decent living wage and dignity of labour. On that march, people came out on the streets to clap us on November the 30th from the shops. So I'll leave you with this image, and that's La Passionara, because I think it really symbolises what the labour movement represents in this city. It was Arthur Dooley, who was a Catholic communist from Liverpool, who was a sculptor, and I just think it symbolises something that we can draw on to give communities that are disenfranchised the confidence, the self-confidence, rather than individually call them workless, feckless and blame them for their poverty.